What we're going to be painting now is wild roses. We're going to be working in a wet into wet sort of painting style, but we're going to keep it controlled because we're working sort of petal to petal across this flower. To get started, we are going to apply masking fluid to the centers. And what masking fluid does is it helps protect the paper and keeps paint off while you're painting some of the other colors. It keeps it white, and then that way you can go back in and do some details maybe that would be more difficult if to try and save when you're working with water like we're going to be tonight. I'm using a palette knife to put it on. It's easier to clean off the masking fluid and it fits into the neck of the bottle really well. You can also use a paintbrush. I would say to use, if you had some inexpensive childlike paintbrushes, the soft bristles, I do recommend if you plan on using soap on it first and get it into the bristles, then it should be able to be cleaned out fairly easily. But masking fluid is almost like a rubber cement, that they used years ago in office work, things like that. So it's kind of a rubbery finish when it dries, so it does have a tendency to wreck anything fabricy or soft that it gets onto, so you want to be careful you don't spill. If you do accidentally knock the bottle over, which I have on your painting, just let it dry and you can rub off without causing any problems. Another nice thing with masking fluid is if you've painted something and you want to protect it, say if you're doing the background, what you would do is cover the painted area with your masking fluid and then go ahead and paint, once it's dried, you can then paint the background, and once it's all off. They've got special lifters. You can either rub it off with your finger, you can use one of those white plastic type eraser too, but the special masking fluid lifting erasers, it's almost like the crepe sole of a shoe. The soft, sort of a flexible rubber. You can tell I've had mine for a while, but that's what we'll use when it's all dry to lift the paint off of there, or the masking fluid. So we're going to let this dry as it's wet. So here I have one that I've started. I've already put the masking fluid on. You can see it's dry and see how the paint beads up on the top, but it allows me to get in and do some painting to fill in the petals. What I have found, what's easiest right now with this project is decide on a color you want to use for the petals. If you mix a color, because you will go through more than you realize to try and mix a matching color, then you end up with petals that all of a sudden are not the right color or don't match. I usually use Windsor Red. Cadmium Red's another good color. If you're more into the pinks, there's the Permanent Rose, Opera Pink, Alizarin Crimson, any of those kind of colors, but what I would recommend is make sure that you do stick with the one color when you're initially starting. Normally what you would do, especially if you've got your paint already in your palette, is get some water in there to start softening the colors that you're going to need. So here I've got my red out. I'm going to quickly put some water on my green, sap green, cerulean blue. We'll be using that in our background just to get some water on there to start getting the paints to kind of soften up. Some of these paints I've had in here for years, I keep adding colors on top. It's just when they first come out kind of the consistency of toothpaste, and I find it's easier to let them set up in your palette and then put water on them to reconstitute them, and you don't go through as much paint as you would otherwise. Now the first thing I've done here is kind of goofed up by using my big brush. I like to use my flat brush to apply water to the petal that I'm going to work on, and then you can use your round brush to actually apply the paint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get one of these petals wet. And then I'm going to take my round brush and I'm going to pick up some of the paint, and starting towards the center, because that's the petal, as if you've deeper towards the center of the flower, and then work your way out. I'm going to apply the color, rinse off that excess, and then I'm going to use my brush to just drag this color out. And what's going to happen here is your petals, this is going to be the lightest color. If you're going to have lighter colors on your areas, it's applied at this time. We will go back in after it's dried to build up some of the area to add more color, to strengthen it in shadow and things like that. Now some of the petals have gotten folds on them, and I don't paint those initially when I start because it's easier to get a slight color variation once you've let it dry, and go back and do that afterwards as part of our step, and we'll do that here too. So again, I'm going to apply paint towards the center of the flower, And then here, if I want, I can drag it up along the edge because it's tucked under. Here, it's got an interesting little tuck or fold. If you want to accentuate a little bit, you can drag some of that color initially up to show that. And then what I'll have on I always have a washcloth just to catch that extra water for me. And then I'm going to go ahead, because then my brush is still moist enough, but I'm not necessarily like this. And I'm going to go ahead and draw the color out here on my petals. Sometimes if you get the little white spots, it's kind of a fun addition there. It does make it look like it's an actual, original kind of, it's just sort of an effect here, what's going to happen a bit. So what I'm going to do now is I've cleaned off my brush and I've decided I want to lighten some of this. If you want to lift some color, you can just clean off your brush and draw back and lift some of that color if you want to have a highlight in there that maybe you hadn't thought of before. Just go ahead and pick it up with your clean but not very wet brush. You can go back in and add to it. And I'm going to quickly do just one of these surfaces, and then I will go ahead, we'll move on to the next step here, but I want to show you just painting here. A lot of times with the fold, you may have the highlight of color, but in this case, we'll have it's kind of under a petal, so we're going to want to give it a little bit more color. And again, clean off your brush and just drag that along the edge there. And then what will happen, it's happened here a little bit, that's the thing with working with red, is it beads back and it will give you a little bit of an outline. We'll work with that a little bit. You don't want too much of an outline, but it's already popping the difference to show that that's rolled over. Okay. Now I'm going to go back in now. The painting, I've initially done all the individual petals. I'm going to go in with just my red on my round brush, and I'm going to go in and start developing a little bit more depth. One of the tricks here, as you're trying to figure out, well, what do I shadow, what don't I shadow? When you're looking at your petals as you've sketched them out, see, in some cases you've got the complete round petal. In other cases, the other one butts up to it. If a petal or a line butts up to it, it means this one is behind that one. So if you're going to go into here, you can then add some shadow to help pop this forward and push this back. What I'll do a lot of times is put in a little bit of color, sort of like when we were growing up, using a coloring book, you sort of do an outline. Well, what I want you to do is kind of develop that into an edge. And to do that, I've paint along the edge, and then we'll just use some water to kind of blend that away. And it gives you an edge to your color. It helps pop it out a little bit better because you really don't need to have a real thick line there. You don't want to. And then what I'll do sometimes, especially with red, is just using a little bit more water. It helps you get a better idea when you kind of pull that water across the petal, and then you don't end up with some edges that don't have a soft blending to them, that are a little harder lines. And then in here, just to develop a little bit more depth around your centers. One thing when you're painting on a smooth object, whether it be round or like in the case of these, it's a little spiky, but what you'll want to do is sort of develop your shading or blending in the shape of the object that you're painting. You don't necessarily want to have something come across here and have it painting like this, because that's not the petal is not rough like that. It is a smooth, more smooth here. So we're just going to take some, spiking it away. Yes, the centers are spiky, but you don't have to worry about necessarily having the texture on your flower be that way too. You want to have it kind of smooth and blend into the shape and to what the object actually is to describe the surfaces. What I'm going to do right now is, here, and I'll these folds a little bit more. What's nice about this particular painting compared to the birch is you don't necessarily have to have it taped down. It makes it a little easier for you to work some of these edges without getting having too many issues with making it uncomfortable to get it to, for your hand to move the way you want. Now see, I've got it wet with paint and developing the fold here, the roll, to kind of develop the shadow underneath there. And what I've done is I like to put it sort of in a center area, and then I will actually drag some of that color along a way to give it a finer end to it. You don't necessarily have to apply paint to it. And here I'm going to increase this a little bit more, develop that curl as it comes into the flower here. So I added some more paint. But then just with water, And with a trusty paper towel or your tissue, you can pick up some of that excess, but that's how you want to develop those rolls. See, it kind of gives a bit of a shadow, it gives it a curl. Up here, what I had done initially is given it a little bit more color along the fold so that the highlight edge would be more contrast to the fold, where it is overshadowing the petal. But you can always go back and develop that a little bit more if you want. Again, apply the paint, make sure, especially in the case of dry, red can be a little more staining than some of your other colors, and then just sort of apply that on. So go back in and lift some of that highlight. But see, it kind of gives the feel of that roll. All right, so next what I'm going to do is we will work on the centers. To do that, this is all dry, I'm going to lift the center with my masking lifter, and you can see it kind of gets it started and it'll pull the whole thing up. If you're rubbing it with your hand, you can do that too, but you want to make sure your hand isn't onto your paper either. And so you can rub it with your finger to get it off, and if you get it started a lot of times, so you can just peel it off to use this. I've had this for a long time. A lot of places where you find the masking fluid, they actually, so you're able to get the lifter and be able to do it properly. Now what I'm going to do for the centers here, use it a little more thickly. I'm not going to have it quite as liquidy because then I'll put in the green center and they kind of play with each other, play off each other pretty well there to develop the look I want for those centers. So you can see it's a lot of pigment, not a lot of water, but you do need some water in there. And I'm going to start working around the edge. So some of these white will be perfect, and some of them you'll have just on the pink. You can leave some spaces kind of open. That little white gives it sort of a reflective or a little sparkle. And see, I kind of work my way around the center. And then what I'm going to do is actually a little area in the middle. So it's almost like you're developing an inner tube or wreath or something here by painting some of the center and painting some of the edges. What I've done is in stroking upward, it's kind of giving a feel that the flower is tipped up a bit to have the spikes coming up on one side of it as it comes to the center and not all the way around it. Now what I'll do is I'll grab some of my sap green. I don't want it, well, not too thick, but don't want it real runny either. Now what I'm going to do is while it's still in the center here and I just painted the yellow, I want to have them wet. I'm going to go ahead and paint in some of the green. And what's kind of nice is, again, you've got a little bit of white so it sparkles, and yet the green and the yellow where they touch, they're blending just a little bit. You can see just a little bit of it bleeding around in there, which is what you want. Just gives it a little softer, a little more gentle look. But that's how I'll develop a little bit more in a couple of spots to really pop that center with my dark color. Here, I can show you one more time on here. The yellow, cadmium yellow, wet but not too runny. And again, go in and just sort of stroke around the edges. If it turns out it's a little too wet, you can always dry that off just a little bit. And just sort of stroke these colors around. You can see how when we drag the masking fluid, that's what's kind of fun to see these little ends, even after having painted on them. Okay, and again, I'm going to work a little bit with the center here. Work a little bit more yellow. Okay, pick up some more green. And again, work that around the edge. Maybe green too. There we go. Yellow and the green have kind of overtaken each other in the middle. Because the yellow is painted first, I can go in and lift a little bit of that green on my paper towel to brighten up that yellow again. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in with my, I guess I should list it on there too, just a little bit of an orange or brown. Actually, I take that back. I'm going to use a little bit of my burnt sienna again that we'd used in the Far Rabbit here. What I'd like to do is give just a little bit of a color around the edge to develop somewhat of a, it gives you a little bit of a dimension to here that you don't get when you're just have the yellow and the green. It looks just a little kind of flat, and this gives it a little bit more depth to it. Gives a little bit of a shadow shape to it, sort of as it's sitting in the center there. the sun is setting. That one might be a little more wet, that's why it's kind of blending in faster, but it's just kind of that idea is what you want to give it is a little additional texture, a little different additional dimension, shadow in there. Center, we did that first. We can start working with some of our outer, working with the leaves and getting those painted too. What's kind of fun is to have either a plastic palette knife, even your palette knife will work, to get some effects on the center of your roses, the leaves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take my sap green, which I just used in the center, kind of blew it out. To me, rose petal, well, I guess they all vary, depends on the version of the rose. We're going to give it just a little bit of a bluey green leaf. I'm going to go ahead at this point and I'm going to paint in the whole leaf, all with the one color. But what I'm going to do next is take my palette knife and take it the broad way. Don't drag it the narrow way, but the broad way. And it's kind of fun as you're developing a vein because you've put a groove in the paper and the paint is settling down into that groove, kind of giving the leaf a bit of a vein, a center vein. And you can go through, after it's dry, we'll go in and give it a little bit more color to give some change in texture for the leaf, so it's not all the same color. And you can do the same thing on that one. I could actually now see if you wait a little bit longer and scrape a little bit of a white because the paint is more dry, so you're actually scraping, it's not as dry as I thought, so you're actually scraping down to the paper. There we go. Just an extra little hint there. And again, like you did with your other, with the pink, you can go back in and you can pick up on the leaf. You put a little bit of the yellow to give it a little bit of a brightness. Another hint too, and I will do that on here as it's dried, is, especially because you're using the red on your main subject here, red either in your, if you've painted woods, a woodsy scene and you've got something in the background there, just to brighten it up a little bit, is to actually put a little wash of red on it, which works out really well. It's kind of a fun finish. Adds a little bit of a sparkle. Painting our leaves. Notice we had a rosebud. What I'm going to do here is start out with a light wash, and I'll let it dry as it goes, but I'm going to put a bit of a wash of red on here like we did with the petals. And that's something I should have caught a little earlier so it would be dry by now, but we'll let it set up here. It doesn't have to be real strong, but just going to apply the red here. And then once it's had a chance to dry, we can go in and develop a little bit of a roll, one of the petals as they're just starting to open on here. In the meantime, I'll work a little bit more. Grab my palette knife. And you can either give it a slight dab there to get some of that liquid off. If you want to put in a little bit of a yellow as this dries back in here. No, not quite a touch of the red. And some of this, if you ever have something overlap, extend too far, a little bit of additional moisture and a dab will take that off. There are some other tricks. At this point, I haven't done anything that I need to do too drastic a correction, but watercolors aren't as daunting as you think. There are ways to correct things that have happened. You have a little trouble sometimes with reds. Some of the green tints are a little more staining, but a lot of these you're able to just use a little water to help pick up and clean up an area if you need to help freshen that up a little bit. Okay, just kind of green. It's nice if you work with it while it's still wet, it'll just blend and do its own changing. Here's the colors sort of work together. Okay, I have to let those leaves dry. I'm going to quick paint up some of these other ones and then I'll have to let them dry because they've got to do the background and I didn't think of doing that. I'm just going to touch base on this little rosebud Kind of the same thing we did with putting an edge of color, we'll be doing the same with the rose. What I'd like to do is take the paint along what would be the under petal and draw that line along of paint and clean off my brush, and then I'm just going to use some moisture, just blend that away. So it does make it a little darker because it's underneath, but yet it helps define the edge of that petal that's just ready to open up. Also too, to help develop shape, we should do some shading down in here. Get some of the darker color. Give some shape to the petal, see? So we kind of have our rosebud. Just a little indication of it there. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and move forward with the background. So in doing the background, you're going to want your 1-inch brush. I like to use colors that are in the painting, and also in this case you're thinking, okay, it's a rose bush, depending on which way you're looking at it, wild roses out there. You could even have some cerulean blue, some sky color in there. So first what will happen is I have all my paints prepared. I'm going to start by getting an area wet. It just helps to blend and smoothen that color better. What is nice too, and I'll show you the trick here also, is when your the background is wet, it helps to blend colors that butt up against each other so you don't have a hard line. So just wet a little area at a time because you can get it wet as you go. So in this case, because we're right here, I'm going to go ahead and, being it's in amongst the roses, I'm just going to add some green. Oops, keep that clean. Just start with the green in here. So you start by putting that in, and you can see with the water it's already kind of helping itself move. I'm going to clean off some of that excess and some of that extra moisture and just sort of work with. You may not want to work with your flat brush. I did because I was getting the paper wet, and I've got a pretty good control of what's happening with the brush. You may want to, after you get your water on, actually grab your paint with your round brush to get in here and do some of the detail. Get some of that close up. What's kind of nice is if you've gone over the edge a little bit of your petals, you want to develop a little bit more, you're able to go in with the water background here and with your paint and just kind of crisp up edges. Now if it gets up into your paint a little bit onto an area you don't want, again, like I said, just here's some more. Some leaves around here. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to put in a little bit of the blue. I'm going to work with a little bit of sky here. So I've got my green, my water, my paper is wet still here, so I'm going to pick up some of the cerulean blue. I always like to bring it out onto the palette because it helps make sure your paint's blended and you don't have clumps that maybe will add a funny streak to your painting or whatever you're working on here. And I'm going to go ahead and start up. If you ever come to an end and you want to actually stop, make sure you use some water, and you can basically blend off whatever end of paint that you have here, and it'll pretty much fade away to clear. Now I'm going to take the color, see, up against my green, and because they both were wet, they're just going to kind of work their ways together and soften the edges of each other. The edge of the, as far as your background to the edge of the paper as you want. It's kind of fun to have, in these more natural, to have the deckled edge of the paper show. Also with the birch, as you noticed the earlier project, when you tape it, it's actually got a nice white finished edge, which also looks good. So you can, you use your own discretion, whichever way you prefer. This can, of course, be taped down and painted that way too, whichever you prefer. Oops, and I just realized I'm getting ahead of myself here. I don't have any water, but we'll just grab some. There we go. Start blending this. So I'm kind of working greens and the sky, if there's some leaves back in there, but what I also would like to do is take, I'm going to grab some of my pink. Now one thing you want to keep in mind, as you come up to the edge of something, you do want to make sure you drag a little bit of, in this case the green, across a couple of the, the stems, because otherwise it'll draw people's eye. They're going to look right at it and go, oh my gosh, look, they stopped the color here. So I'm going to just add some water to help blend that. And I'm going to pick up just a little bit of the red as soon as I get some of this I just got a little tint in it. I'm being a little lazy here, not pulling out all the, not getting some new water ready, but we're okay because we'll be putting this color in. So I'm going to add some of the red. I'll start blending it. I've got it on either side of the stem. I'm going to bring it on the side of the leaf here. So it kind of gives you a little hint that there's another rose back there, maybe. The layers. I'll make sure to bring this out here. You want it to just continue your green. Make sure you put just a little touch of it onto the other side, and it just makes it work. And because it was wet, it's already sort of blending itself in a little bit. Just for fun, put in a little touch of this yellow here. It's kind of a little bright. And just gradually work your way all the way around the painting. What kind of adds a fun effect if you want, plop it in here to show you, but like I'll call it, it's an oozle, and actually there's kind of one going here too. You can see where water has come onto the paper that's a little more, you've got an area that's more wet than the surrounding area. Your paper starts drawing the water back and kind of gives it a little oozle. It gives a little bit of an attention to a little different detail so that you can, background, you want to have a little variation or difference. So that is the last step to finish. Here's our finished product. See here again, this is a better example of an oozle, drop of water here. It's just something that gives a little bit more character to the watercolor, and it's perfectly natural, perfectly normal. It just worked out really well. But this is your finished project. See a little bit of shading around the centers, some fun development of the buds, and then you're finished with